Good morning. My name is Kim Gubler and I'm Chair of PASA. And welcome to the PASA Dashboard Value Guidance webinar. Now, before we start, you may have seen that we've had a ministerial statement this morning following the dashboard's reset. Came out just after 10 and the regulations will be due later on this afternoon. But we're still waiting on the detail. And basically, until we have that, we can't really say an awful lot more. However, the main point is the connection dates have moved from regulations to guidance. DWP will be collaborating with the industry on those revised dates. But on first glance, the important point to note is that the dashboard available point could be linked to the dates in the guidance rather than the backstop. So the approach hasn't changed. So listen in for more news later. For today, we're looking at, as I say, the values guidance. Because while regulations can never provide the level of detail required to cover all possibilities, this is actually on purpose. And that's so that schemes can decide the best routes for their own members and their own circumstances. So PASA has brought together the collective experience of industry experts in the PASA Dashboards Client Experience Subgroup. Let me try saying that quickly. And they have set out good practice approaches to circa 20 areas. And today we're launching phase 1 of the guidance. We've got Geraldine Brassett, chair of the subgroup, Paul McGlone, who is responsible for dashboards at Aon, where he is a partner, the Joint Industry Forum, and the SPP. Maurice Titley, who chairs the PASA Dashboards Working Group. Now, research shows that members get most benefit from dashboards if they can see the value data on their pensions. And we want to provide pension savers with a consistent approach across their different pension entitlements. And this is why we believe it's important to help trustees maximise the number of members who will be able to access value data via their dashboards. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're suggesting that schemes reuse as much information as possible that they already provide to members. And finally, by providing this consistency, we'll be minimising as much as possible the operational strain, which could happen post the dashboard available point. And although we're focusing on private sector schemes, we have also considered the needs of public sector schemes. And obviously, there will be more guidance. Questions will be at the end, but you can pop them in the question box online as and when you think of them. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Geraldine Brassett. Thank you, Geraldine.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. So my first slide really is just to outline the agenda for today. So a little recap on where we are with pensions dashboards. It just shows, doesn't it, that you can write something and then minutes before you do a webinar, something changes. So Kim's covered some of that, but we'll just pick up one or two further points. We're going to look at the breadth of PASA dashboard guidance. So the main focus for today is on the value guidance that's being released pretty much as we speak. But we don't want to lose sight of the fact that there is a wealth of PASA guidance already out there to cover data and matching. I'm really pleased that Maurice is joining us today as well to recap on that guidance that's already out there. So focusing specifically on the value data guidance. So, you know, we could keep talking about value data. What we need is pension amounts and DC pots. What are we going to cover today? Well, why did we draft guidance in the first place? What's the purpose of the guidance? We're going to have a deep dive into some of the guidance. There's far too much for us to cover all of it on the call today, but we're going to look at some specific areas. We're going to talk about how to use the guidance and the approaches that we've taken, and then Paul in particular is going to bring the guidance to life by looking at some specific examples of areas where we think industry will get particular benefit, but also you know, we think will be relevant to most of the people on the call. We're also going to touch on AVCs, so hopefully you saw the announcement earlier this week of the work that we're doing with AVC providers, again, to try and simplify the process for industry to get a level of consistency and to avoid reinventing that infamous wheel that Kim referred to earlier. So Paul, at the end of his agenda item, will pick up and look specifically at the work we're doing on AVCs. And then, as Kim says, the plan, if all goes to plan, is to leave time at the end for questions and answers. So moving on to the next slide. So recap on the current position. So Kim sort of talked about how we, you know, what was announced today, and acknowledged that we need more detail. And that's obviously in response to the ministerial statement that was on the 2nd of March 2023. But I think it's very important that since then, you know, DWP and other regulatory bodies have been working very closely with industry and have, you know, as such, consulted informally with us, so that we've had the opportunity to input to the piece of work that they're now doing and the announcements that are coming. But I think it's really important that that's about the dates. It's not about what we need to do. It's about when we need to do it. And actually, the message all the way through this has been that the regulations and standards, which are the things that are driving the value data that we're talking about today, are fit for purpose. And therefore, we are, you know, we should be confident that we can use those regulations and standards in our pensions dashboard solutions. So I think that that's a very important point. During this sort of reset period as well, the pensions regulator has been very clear in their messaging, which is there is a lot to do on data, and that includes value data. And actually, schemes should just be cracking on with that. They should be engaging with their providers, understanding the gaps in their data, and putting action plans in place to fill those gaps. So this is very much about, we have extra time, but we need that extra time, and it's important that we get as much value from that as we can to maximise the saver experience. Other things to think about in terms of where we are at the moment. So we need to continue the engagement with trustees, but we should also continue our engagement with other stakeholders. So I've referenced AVC providers, with actuaries. You know, we will have sort of compliance timescales in which to produce value data. We may well need actuarial support to do that sometimes. We've highlighted in the guidance there might be occasions where schemes will need legal advice. It's good to know that now. And again, I hope our guidance will help identify those situations. And then, as we've said, help is already out there for matching and for saver FAQs. So we're building on support and work that PASA has already done. So this is a fairly quick slide. This is about the group that we've been all working with. So this is what we call our scheme configuration or client experience subgroup. We are a multidisciplinary team. So we have got administrators, we've got actuaries, that's why Paul's here as well. We have a legal advisor, an in-house representative, representatives from other third parties, and we've got members from public and private sector. We didn't want this to be just private sector or just public sector. We thought it was important that it covered everything. We've also reached out to other industry bodies, and we've also reached out to the regulators. So, you know, we've tried to make it as inclusive as we can. So you can see on the list there who we've worked with, and, you know, a big thank you to the whole group, because it has been, you know, a big piece of work, which you'll see when you actually get to look at the guidance. And we are quite a small group, so PASA is hugely grateful to all those who've contributed, and I'm personally very grateful as chair of the group as well. So why do we need value data guidance right now? So Kim referenced the importance to savers of being able to actually see their pensions values. And anyone who, like me, has spent quite a lot of time looking at the standards and the regulations will know that they set out the what, but they don't always set out the how. So some of today is thinking about the how. That's intentional because, you know, if you work across multiple schemes, you'll know you have different scheme structures, different demographics, different approaches to providing information, different AVC providers, you know, different benefit structures, and the list is not endless, but it can be quite long. So we need that flexibility to reflect the needs of individual schemes and to help them maximise the value of that. But we need to do that in a way that achieves the best outcome for all stakeholders to the service. So as I said, Paul will illustrate this in his session, and he's going to look at more detail at certain aspects of the guidance. But I think it's important as well to recognise that dashboards are new to all of us, you know, so we are all learning a little bit as we go along. And it's created some interesting discussions in the group sometimes about, you know, the best way to do things. And that's why your feedback on the guidance and areas that you'd like us to look at will be really, really important. We've taken the view that trustees will be looking to their providers for support with pragmatic and cost-effective solutions. This is probably not about, you know, calculating everything to the nth degree. It's about what will resonate well with the member. And that's the sort of the backdrop of the guidance that we've prepared. As providers, we hope the guidance will help initiate the right conversations with trustees, but also, you know, particularly now when we're talking about timescales, you know, that it will serve to illustrate the amount of configuration work that we actually need to do. But most importantly, because dashboards are all about outcomes and the saver experience, that they'll see a level of consistency and they will see information that they will understand. So the next slide really sets out the principles. So I talked just now about, you know, the context within which the guidance has been drafted. This slide sets out the principles that are underlying our guidance. I'm not going to go through them now on the call because Paul's got far more interesting things to talk to you about, but I would encourage you to read the introductory section before you dive into the guidance. So if you're like me and you love detail, you'll go straight to what about, you know, split NRAs. What I would encourage you to do is read these principles first, because they do, as I say, provide that context for the way that the guidance is drafted. So it's really there just for today as a pointer for you to have a look at those. So moving on to the next slide. So what should you expect to find in terms of the structure? So each piece of guidance is in a separate guidance note, so you don't have to read the whole lot to find the bit that you're looking for. For each guidance note, you'll see our thought process. So you'll see, you know, how we've identified the importance for dashboards, why it applies, what typically happens now, a reflection on, is that different in the public sector from the private sector, and then our suggested ways forward. Typically, there might be one recommended approach, but where it's appropriate to do so, we will have suggested several approaches. If that works, you know, different schemes again will have different needs, so you will find that we have potentially suggested multiple approaches. We've deliberately provided some recommendations or some suggested ways forward, because I think feedback from previous experience on guidance, those reading it have said we want that sort of help to know how to take things forward. So where we have an option or a range of options, we've highlighted those in each piece of guidance. They're not prescriptive. We can't cover all scenarios. It is good practice guidance, and it remains the responsibility of the schemes to take advice where it's appropriate to do so. So this is to help, but not necessarily to tell you exactly what to do. I'm going to move on very quickly now, because I'd like Paul and Maurice to have the most of the time. When I said it was substantive, hopefully this illustrates that I was what I was trying to indicate. So these are the areas that are covered by the guidance. So you can see there's a lot of content there. As I said, they are all in individual guidance notes. There's 20 of them. So that should help you find your way and navigate around to the information that you need, obviously, once you've read the introductory piece. And this is the same slide, but you can see that there are some areas highlighted in a sort of burgundy colour. And those are the areas that Paul's going to cover now and talk to you through the content of the guidance in those particular areas. So on that basis, I'm going to hand over to Paul, who's going to pick those up.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. So as Geraldine said, we're going to now do a, I think it was described as a deep dive, although even this is only really going to be scratching the surface of it, and we'll give you a flavour of what's in the guidance when you go and read it in full, and hopefully a number of you will go and read it in full. I am going to canter through this quite quickly. I know we've got lots of pensions experts on the call, so I'm not going to stop and explain basic concepts. And I want to start with is on retirement age. The pension figure you need for deferred members when you're looking at dashboards is essentially the benefit revalued from date of leaving up until a recent date. And I mean, to be honest, even that simple calculation has some complexities. First of all, what do we mean by retirement age, by normal retirement age? I think I know what I mean, but apparently it's not always as simple as that. So if you're in any doubt, then please ask your scheme lawyer what retirement age means from your scheme. Secondly, what do we mean by revaluation? A number of people have pointed out that technically GMPs only exist as a defined value at leaving and at GMP age, and anywhere else in between is strictly, they don't exist. We took the view in the guidance that what we think is a common sense view, which is, yes, you do revalue GMPs between leaving and retirement age, and you give the figure partway through because that's what makes most sense. So that means that you split your benefit into tranches, you revalue each of those tranches, and then you add them all up again. Now, that works in a simple situation where you have a member who has left and is not yet reached their normal retirement age. But things quickly get more complicated, and one of the items on the next slide that the guidance covers is what happens if someone is over normal retirement age. Now, the subgroup decided there wasn't really a single answer to this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, not all schemes have the same benefits, and because they don't have the same benefit, they've got different rules, they've got different ways that pensions might be calculated beyond normal retirement age. And that will also vary between deferreds and actives. But also, even where schemes do have identical benefits, they might be administered in different ways. Not all of our administration platforms record things in exactly the same way. So we concluded that for members over normal retirement age, there were a number of options. And if you look at the next slide, you can see some of these mentioned. One option is you revalue benefits up to normal retirement age, and you simply quote that. It will be out of date. So if someone's age 68, for example, and their NRA of 65, then the benefit will still be quoted at 65. But on the positive side, it does mean that it will remain the same figure from year to year. Another option we thought was reasonable was to say, yes, we will increase benefits beyond normal retirement age, maybe up to the most recent scheme anniversary or some date that's consistent with what you're doing for other members. And if you do that, then of course you need to think about what are you going to increase it with. You could simply continue to apply deferred revaluations. That probably isn't the benefit the member's entitled to, but it would be an easy calculation. Or you could start to do things like late retirement factors and actually work out exactly what would apply. That's going to be very scheme specific. It's probably more in line with what the member will actually get, but it's going to be more complicated to do. Now, which thing you decide to do doesn't just depend on theoretically what you think is the best approach. It's also going to depend on, well, what do your systems do, and what can your systems do with some additional coding. There's no doubt that probably everything we talk about today, administrators can calculate these numbers, but for dashboards to be pre-populated, this information needs to be not only something that an administrator can calculate, it needs to be something which is fully automated, so it can be done without human intervention. It needs to be automated in a way that it can be run in bulk, not just on individual members, because that will be needed to load it into dashboards. And it needs to be checked rigorously enough that you're happy for it to be released onto dashboards without anybody actually looking at it. Now that's quite a high bar, and it's whether it's a calculation that you already have in your systems or whether it's a calculation you plan to build, it is quite a high bar before it can be released onto dashboards. Of course, there's a final option here, which is to not do any calculations and to simply say to the member, we will return a figure within 10 working days. If you're going to do that, that's perfectly valid, but you'll need to think about capacity to do that, and that's one of the things I'll talk about in a moment. I've mentioned active members on the slide as well. They have some different issues. I'm not going to talk about them today in the interest of time, but there are some comments in the guidance and on the slide about the implications for active members who are over NRA. Now, before jumping on to the next area, I thought it was worth reflecting on the next slide about some of that thought process that we've just been through. And apologies, the font looks a little bit slow, a little bit small here. You'll probably start with every one of these questions by thinking, what is the theoretical best approach that we should take when quoting these benefits? And certainly that was in our mind when we looked at the various questions on the PASA subgroup. But you also need to think about actually what do we already have? You know, what calculations do we have properly defined? What are automated? Which can be run in bulk? The sorts of issues I've just talked about. You might want to think about what you could automate, you know, what's easy to code up in the future. But you're also going to be thinking about, well, what makes sense to the members? Remembering that whatever you put on the dashboard, you can't put any wording on that explains what you've done. So the figures you load pretty much need to be self-explanatory. And although most people think of a dashboard as an administration task, in practice, we expect there to be all sorts of different perspectives applying when you take these views on value data. The issues noted in this guidance tend to be non-standard calculations. And it's often those non-standard calculations where administrators and trustees turn to the actuary, turn to the lawyers, turn to a number of other people and say, you know, what do you think? What should we be doing? So if you only take a few things away from this session, I think one of them should be that please don't think of this as purely an administration task. Please do think you will need to involve advisors beyond just the administration team to deal with some of the complex cases. Finally, one of the things you'll need to think about, and again, this will apply in all of the different situations we're going to talk about today, is how many members are affected. If you've got, for example, 1,000 members over normal retirement age, you probably do want to automate something and not be quoting calculations on an ad hoc basis. If you've only got 10 members over normal retirement age in your scheme, actually, you probably can cope with dealing them on an ad hoc basis. So the next slide, what if a member has got 2 normal retirement ages? Now, I know the lawyers in the room will say, yeah, members can't have 2 normal retirement ages, they can only have 1, and I get that, but we know what we mean by this. We have so many members who have, for example, an NRA of 65, and then we've got a Barber pension that's due at 60. Now, one option that immediately comes to mind is, well, why don't we split the benefit in 2 and quote on dashboards 1 benefit at 60 and 1 benefit at 65? That feels straightforward. The problem is with how the dashboard will show that information. On the next slide, we've got a picture from the Data Usage Guide Appendix. Now, this was a document issued by the Pensions Dashboard Programme, and it gives an example of what happens if, sorry, I'm getting a message saying people can't see that, but hopefully you can see that. This gives an example of what happens if the different tranches of benefit are posted on the dashboard. It will show them coming into payment at different dates. So we all know that for DB pensions, where someone's got a benefit at 65 and some payable at 60, they don't actually come into payment at different dates. They come into payment at the same date with adjustments. Now, actually allowing for adjustments in dashboards, allowing for early and late retirement factors, goes way beyond what we think dashboards are intended to do. So this was discussed at great length in our subgroup, and there were pros and cons of everything we came up with, but on the next slide, we've set out where we landed. And where we landed was that we suggest a single pension figure is returned based on the higher of those normal retirement ages, so typically age 65. We don't think it makes sense to start adjusting the revalued pensions to allow for early and late retirements. Now, we know that's not ideal, but frankly, there's no other way to explain in dashboards what's been done and that some of this benefit is payable and reduced at an earlier age. Now, as Geraldine said, you are welcome to consider other options. This is not a decision for you. This is broad guidance. If you come up with another option which is better than this, we'd love to hear about it, but this is the best that we could come up with. I'm very happy for someone to come up with a better option and tell us later. If we move on, we've talked about what happens if you're over retirement age. We've talked about what happens if you've got 2 retirement ages. Of course, you could find you're in both of those situations. You could find you've got a member who is over their Barber NRA and under their actual NRA. I'm not going to attempt to deal with this today. Suffice to say that, again, there are some observations and some thought processes in the guidance. Have a look at it and hopefully it will be helpful. Now, if I take a breath there, I've spent the last 8 slides and probably about 8 minutes talking just about normal retirement age. What I'm going to do now is spend the next 8 slides and maybe another 8 minutes or so talking about everything else, but in a lot less detail. We'll start with retirement age for DC schemes. You've probably gathered that most of this guidance is about DB. There are some DC issues in the guidance, but honestly not that many. And that's partly because the expertise of the group was primarily about DB. It's partly because there are fewer issues for DC, but we are expecting more DC guidance in later versions. One thing to flag for now is have a think about what normal retirement age means for DC schemes. In particular, what if a member has specified a target retirement date that's different to their normal retirement date in the scheme rules? So if that's the case, do have a chat with your lawyer about what you're going to do for dashboards, which of those dates you're going to use. Next slide is on GMP equalisation. The Lloyds court case was now almost 5 years ago. Despite that, my experience is the vast majority of schemes have not yet equalised. So an obvious question is, what should we do for dashboards? In theory, dashboards should give members the best indication of their benefits, and you may say, well, that's the equalised benefit. In practice, it's not that easy. Most schemes just haven't done the work yet, so they don't have the information to know whether male or female benefits are higher. And even if they do, it would be awful to try and explain this in a dashboard where we have to simplify the benefits. So on balance, we felt it was reasonable for most schemes to just quote the original sex benefits. That's on the basis that for most schemes, that's all they have. For most members, the difference will be modest. And actually, a lot of equalisation is done when members retire. It's not done in the years before they reach retirement age. And for most people, they'll be looking at dashboards well before their normal retirement age. The one exception to this is if you have deferred members who have already been converted, then those post-conversion benefits should be quoted on dashboards. But other than that, we felt that pre-equalisation benefits were appropriate. Next slide is about underpins and guarantees. Now, this is a section where, honestly, where we've landed is a bit of a fudge. Theoretically, any guarantee should be reflected in the benefits quoted on dashboards, but we also know that things are not as practical as that. A lot of guarantees are only actually tested at retirement. They're not tested every year. And so where we landed was, we said, if schemes have guarantees which are material and the calculations are available, then you should include them. If you've got guarantees that are not really material, it makes sense to try and exclude them. We don't think dashboards are intended to try and force you to calculate benefits every year that are really not very material. The challenge, and this is the hardest bit, is if you've got guarantees that you think are material, but actually you don't have calculations readily available, then what do? You know, you could argue we should probably do that, but a lot of us simply don't have that information available in our administration systems at the moment. One specific type of that is GMPs, so DC schemes contracted out on a GMP basis, which I think is relatively common out there. But what we found when we asked around is that in the majority of cases, members are only quoted DC benefits in a normal day-to-day administration, and the GMP test is typically only done at retirement, even though it can make quite a material difference. So if that's an issue for you, then that is something where you're going to have to go away and talk to the trustees, talk to the administrators, work out, you know, what can we do, where are we comfortable landing? Are we comfortable not allowing for that GMP underpin? Temporary pensions is another item which we see quite regularly across schemes, whether it's called a temporary pension or a bridging pension or you know, state pension integration. And this is one where I think there is a very clear preference. The example in the guidance talks about a member whose pension starts at £10,000 at age 62 and then drops down to £8,000 when they hit state pension age, which you've said here is 67. And we've illustrated three options that we thought about on the slide. The first is to quote a £10,000 pension on dashboards from 62, and then a minus £2,000 pension from 67. That feels very clunky. I don't think dashboards will allow us to quote negative amounts, so I think we should avoid that. It might be how some administration systems record it, It might be how it's described in some benefits, but we don't think it works for dashboards. The second option we thought about is whether we could say the pension is £10,000 from 62 to 67, and then it's £8,000 from 67 onwards. The danger with that is, while it looks good in a graph, if you put it in a table, then you see two pensions. You see a £10,000 pension and an £8,000 pension. And there's bound to be members who simply add up those two figures and think, oh, that's great, I'm going to get £18,000. So we didn't think that was a sensible option. What we thought the most appropriate option for most people was option 3, and that's to quote the permanent pension, in this case the £8,000 a year, and on top of it to quote the temporary pension of £2,000 a year. That means that if the members add up the two numbers, they get the right amount, and it's quite simple to quote that in dashboards. So we felt that was the most appropriate approach. Now, while mentioning temporary pensions, this is about step downs when someone hits state pension age. There's also a section in the guidance about step ups. Not going to cover that today, but where you have things like GMP revaluations kicking in at GMP age, there's also a set of guidance on how to deal with that. Now, that's really just a selection of what's in the guidance in terms of detailed items. Before I finish, I want to mention two final things. The last one I'm going to mention is AVCs, but before that, I want to talk about when we refresh all of the different figures that we load into dashboards. In general, administrators don't reissue quotes or benefit statements every time something changes. We wait until the next time a request comes in, or next time something is due to go out. And what we're doing with dashboards is effectively calculating a benefit at a given date and loading that into the dashboard for members to view, where it will typically stay there for maybe up to a year, and then it gets updated. What we shouldn't be trying to do is trying to keep that information constantly updated every time something changes. Now, there are some exceptions. Our interpretation of the dashboards regulations is that you do need to update the information on dashboards when a member exits the scheme, and that means they cease to be a relevant member, so either retirement or death or transfer out, and so those things are on the left-hand side. What the regulations don't need you to do is update the dashboards every time everything else happens. So all of the items on the right-hand side, which I'm not going to read through, are all situations where the member's benefit might change, but you don't, by law, have to update the dashboard. The question you'll have to deal with as administrators and with your trustees is, do we want to update any benefits in these situations, or do we just want to leave it static for the rest of the year and only update it when it gets to the end of the year? And that will be for individual schemes and their administrators to decide. Final thing I'll talk about is AVCs. I've deliberately left this to last. Most DB schemes have got DC AVCs sitting alongside them, run by a separate AVC provider. And the Pensions Dashboard Programme shows 3 different ways that AVCs can be dealt with. You're probably already aware of these, they're on the screen, I'm not going to read them out. What became clear when we talked about this in the subgroup was that there wasn't a consensus on the most likely approach, or rather, there were multiple consensuses. Most third-party administrators favoured the first approach, the single source, where the AVC provider sends the information to them to load to dashboards. A lot of in-house administration teams and public sector schemes took the opposite view. They took the view that they wanted the AVC provider to do all the legwork and connect directly. AVC providers themselves didn't have a strong consensus. Some had assumed they would load AVCs directly, but quite a lot of them hadn't really thought about this when we had these initial conversations. So what we've done on the next slide is we've covered in the guidance quite a lot of detail about how each of these different options will work and what the pros and cons are. There are about 25 sections just within the AVC guidance on these pros and cons. I've pulled out a few things on this slide. The first 5 bullets are all really about what can the providers actually do. So understanding what your main administration system can do, what your AVC provider can do. Some of the key things, and this is probably bullets 3 to 5, is around, who can actually run the fines calculations, who can run the matching rules, who's in a position to actually field calls from members and deal with possible matches. Some AVC providers will have that capability, some frankly don't. Bullet 6 is all about keeping data up to date. So whichever of the options you take, either the administration team will need to keep the AVC provider up to date with certain things, or the AVC provider will need to keep the administration team up to date with certain things. Whichever way you go, there is no option where updates are not needed in one direction or the other. And then finally, bullets 7 or 8 here are about members and finances. So, how many members have we got? How many AVC providers have we got? How much is it going to cost us to do this various work? So all of this needs to be taken into consideration when you're deciding how are we going to deal with AVCs. Where we landed on the final slide is we felt that overall, PASA's view is that most of our members will find the single source of information as the most effective way to deal with this. That administrators will collect information from AVC providers, let's say once a year, and host those directly, and therefore deal with find requests, view requests, and member queries. Now, that won't work for everybody. There will clearly be situations where schemes take a different approach for the reasons outlined in the guidance, but that's where we think the default will be. I should also say, and I think either Geraldine or Maurice may be talking about this in a moment, PASA are also planning to speak to all AVC providers, well, maybe not all, the majority of AVC providers directly. There's a questionnaire that's due to go out so that we can look across the industry and understand what the preferences are and capabilities are across the different providers. Until then, my only advice is make sure this is on your list, start speaking to your AVC providers and understand the options, and don't take anything for granted. I said I'd canter through that quite quickly. I'm conscious I have, but Geraldine, if I'm back to you, if there are any comments you've got and any questions we've got.
That's brilliant, thank you, Paul. So I think we'll definitely have some time for questions at the end, but I think, Maurice, did you want to just do a refresh first of the other guidance that we've got, particularly what's already been published around matching? What we will also do at the end is just pick up the plans for the next phase of the guidance, but I'm going to hand over to Maurice first, if that's okay.
That's great, thank you, Geraldine. Yeah, so I'll keep this relatively brief. I can see there's some good questions coming in. So yeah, if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So yeah, this is just a recap on what we did originally with our data matching convention guidance. So the original guidance was published in December 21. It was core guidance around the use of national insurance number, surname and date of birth as a match criteria that all those involved seem to agree was very much the basic one that was going to be a first choice for most schemes. Other options to enhance this were suggested, and there was some initial discussion on the topic of possible matching, which we'll come on to in a moment, which was at the time also referred to in the document as maybe matching. I think when the regulations came out, the term possible matching kind of settled down as the main term to refer to that. Now, our additional guidance was published in March of this year. So time has moved on, there's been some industry planning and research, and obviously various ISPs and data providers getting ready to think about this and looking at this in more detail. And there were two areas that we wanted to release as an addendum to that guidance. So could I have the next slide, please? So the first topic is matching without national insurance numbers. So first of all, why is this an important thing to consider? So there's a number of reasons why match criteria that don't include national insurance number are really important to consider, and we've listed them on this slide here. So I mean, firstly, users may not provide their national insurance number when they're searching. It's not a mandatory input for a user to provide. Users may not have a national insurance number. They may have a temporary national insurance number that's the best they've got, that they've been currently advised. National insurance number won't be verified. It's going to be typed in by the user. So if there's a slight error in the characters that they type in, then that won't get picked up. And of course, in that case, it almost certainly won't be matching with what you're comparing it with in terms of the administration records. Looking at it from the scheme perspective, schemes may not hold a valid national insurance number for all their members. We know that some schemes don't, and particularly I think schemes that have a lot of automatic enrolment coming in, it can be quite difficult to ensure that you're having valid NI numbers. There might be individuals who've got temporary NI numbers at the point they're enrolled, and that's the information that comes through. So we've certainly seen that in schemes that we've been working with. And schemes may not trust the accuracy of the NI numbers that they hold. And there isn't a way of verifying those in bulk. There isn't a service you can use to compare and verify those. So what does OPHASA guidance propose? It proposes a number of options for match criteria. One of the key ones is to match on the 4 verified data items. So there are 4 items that are going to be nailed on verified coming out of the identity verification service: forename, surname, date of birth, and current postcode. So if you have a solid match on all 4 of those, I think most schemes would be pretty comfortable to say, yes, that's a match, and it's a highly credible match. Another option is to consider using email addresses or mobile numbers in place of NI number. Now, we know that most schemes don't hold mobile numbers, and most schemes don't have very good coverage of email addresses. But if you do hold them, or start to hold them, or if you do already have them, then actually that's a good match. It won't be matching by accident if an email address matches with the one that you hold on your record. So that can be used in place of NI number to give you that certainty in matching. Lastly is to consider using alternative names and postcodes that the user might decide to give you when they do their searching. So they don't have to do this, but they might actually say, okay, my former surname was Smith, or they might say my former address was whatever it is that they input. Now that's not going to be verified, so it loses a little bit of the strength of what we looked at above, but you know, it's still something that I think a lot of schemes will consider could be strong enough in the right match criteria to create a match without using national insurance number. Could I have the next slide, please? So the second topic is possible match responses. So these are responses that schemes need to provide when they don't have a definite match, but they've identified that the individual may well be the member in their scheme. So a classic example is where there's most likely a discrepancy in some of the key personal data, and the scheme might want to use this as an opportunity to get that discrepancy resolved, or they may just not be certain that they've got the individual who is their scheme member and want to invite them through a process to resolve that. Why are they important? Well, it's a very important part of the user experience of dashboards. I think over time, there's no doubt that personal details that are used in matching will continue to have issues. More and more pension arrangement entitlements will be set up over time, and there will be problems with some of that data. And possible matching provides a sort of a safety net for the whole of the dashboard's user experience to point users to pensions that otherwise they just would not see at all on the dashboard. It is required by the regulations. It's covered in terms of the draft consultation documents that the pensions regulator put out in terms of what they're looking for in terms of enforcement. And it's a really important tool for improving data quality on an ongoing basis. So we think possible matching is really important. In terms of how to define a set of match criteria for possible matching, I think the first thing to say is you're likely to use more than one criteria, which is why we talk about them as a set of criteria. So if you imagine a number of tests that you run, and any one of which firing would result in you actually saying to the individual, this is a possible match, please make contact with us. And if you then think about that set of criteria, then what we recommend in our guidance is to say that together, those criteria need to have enough coverage to pick up the members you want to pick up with them. So they need to cover the different types of data discrepancies that you know you're likely to have over time, so that members who are caught by that will actually be invited to be a possible match and won't just be ignored and get no response at all from the scheme. So they need to have enough coverage as a set. However, the other really important point is that each one of these criteria has to be focused enough to avoid creating what we call false positives. So if you had a criteria that simply said surname, let's just match on surname, then clearly that would create huge numbers of false positives and would probably bring down dashboards, let alone cause terrible trouble for the administrator in trying to process all these individuals who are coming through on a wild goose chase, because there will be no pension at the end of that. So there's two really important points that people need to think of when putting together possible match criteria. And just in terms of what some of the options could be, so we look at some of those in the guidance. One of them is to have exact matches on fewer data items. So a criteria that's often talked about, that's not tight enough to actually say you've definitely got the right person. There could be people with the same first name and last name born on the same day, but it's not going to over-invite. There's not going to be a large number of those individuals out there. So that could work really well as a possible match criteria. The other type of possible match criteria are those that use what we call fuzzy matching, and we talk about that in our guidance. So this is where a comparison is made between the data item that the user has provided and the data item on the administration system. So if you take national insurance number in that example where the individual types the national insurance number in slightly incorrectly, then a fuzzy match test could actually say, right, we've picked up the fact that that's very close, and hence we're confident that that's just a data error, most likely on the user's side. And actually, when you add that to the fact that the surname matches and the date of birth matches, then we're very certain we've got the right person. You may still, though, want to actually put that individual down a possible match route to resolve that discrepancy. And as another example, the discrepancy could be on date of birth, in which case you absolutely want to resolve that. Date of birth is a verified data item, so the date of birth you're being told is probably entirely correct, and it's telling you that there's something slightly out with the way date of birth is held on the admin record, so you want to resolve that. So there's much more detail on all of that, plenty of examples to look at that will hopefully help with you deciding how you're going to approach possible match criteria. But for now, yes, that's all I wanted to cover. Happy to take any questions in the next section, but for now, I will hand back to Kim.
Super. Thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Yes. If everyone would like to join us, then we can get on with the questions. I mean, certainly, as was said before, there will be a second phase of guidance that comes out. So anything that isn't covered here, once we've got more detail, or even if there's a situation that arises that you feel that we should look into, then as Geraldine said, to raise that. Now, one of the questions that did come out, which was from Phil, it said, does PASA have a list of ISPs in the market that can help smaller schemes, sort of almost like a sort of out-of-the-box version? And we had a little sort of discussion about that beforehand. No, PASA doesn't. One would expect that to be mainly sort of come out to PDP, but it isn't on there yet. So what we will do is we'll put that question to PDP, and hopefully they'll have some kind of list sort of later. But go on to the actual questions. I'm not quite sure who would want to. Maybe it's one for you, Paul, although it's a DC question. But again, asks, are they obliged to use SMPI for projections, because this is materially different from the calculations, the income calculations that they currently do? They think so that's of limited value to members. What are your thoughts on that?
So you're right. I'm not the DC specialist, but my understanding is that SMPI calculations are effectively what dashboards are expected to cover. Now there's variations of deferred members and active members, and do you have future accrual included or not, and so on. But essentially, I'm expecting a very high level of consistency between SMPI and what's on dashboards. We've also got the new guidance coming out is updated TM1, and I can't remember the implementation dates for that.
October, I think it's
but
October.
there is a sort of transition period, isn't there, where even if you're online, even if you're connected, and to be honest, with the new announcements today and everything else, it may be nobody's online by then anyway, or not connected by then, but there is that transition where you don't have to quote figures until the new TM1 is up and running. So we're not quoting old figures on the old approach.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that quite answers the question, but that's probably all I know about it.
Perhaps, Phil, if you've got sort of a specific question, you can put it through to PASA and we can actually feed that into when we're looking at the DC guidance sort of in more detail. There's one here which I think maybe is in, given Geraldine's provenance, maybe more for you, Geraldine, and it's about GMP step-ups. And what we're being asked is, would it make sense to quote the non-stepped-up pension as it appears consistent with quoting sort of benefits where there's two NRAs, on the, as Paul was saying, the sort of least bad option?
So I think this sort of reverts back to one of our guiding principles, which is try to use information that members will already be familiar with. So typically you wouldn't quote a pension with a GMP step up until you know whether that step up bites or not. So if the member is familiar with a pension, you know, without a GMP step up, then our suggestion would be that that's what you continue to use. Because if members go in and they see different information on a dashboard to the information, for example, that they've seen in their leaving service letter, and they can't relate one to the other, all that will happen is that we will end up confusing them, and we'll get lots of queries. So I think that principle around reusing information that we've got, reusing information that is familiar to the member, that would suggest that we would use the non-stepped up version of the pension. So, you know, very, very consistent then with the guiding principles. While I've got the floor, I was just going to revert to what Paul said is around SMPI, that his understanding is exactly the same as mine, that Dashboard expects SMPI information for DC members. And again, it's back to this consistency point. And I believe that is the consistency on Dashboard that has driven the review of the SMPI basis, to make sure, again, that members have a more consistent approach.
Yeah. You're right, Geraldine, because I was part of that where they were putting it all together.
Yeah, I mean, on the GMP point, I think when you read the guidance, what it actually says is, you know, in theory, you should allow for this GMP step up if it's a material impact on the members' benefits, because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you show them the information you've got? However, we recognise that in practice, most of us don't have that, and therefore it may be reasonable to not do so. So it's trying to tread that fine line, because if we all had the information, why wouldn't you share it with the members?
Exactly. Thank you. I think this is one for you, Maurice. Can an ISP hold data without a view request being made, or does that breach GDPR or other data protection regulations?
So obviously stating the obvious caveat to this, that I'm not a lawyer and all the rest of it. So most ISPs are approaching it in this way, that they will hold view data themselves. I mean, if you look at the standards from the Pensions Dashboards Programme, the Code of Connection standard, so it has a target time for a view request response. It says if you've got the data pre-calculated, then the target time is that you should be able to respond in 2 seconds. And we know that, you know, an awful lot of administration platforms, if you try to build something onto an admin platform to actually do that sort of calculation and aim to actually achieve something as tight as that, it wouldn't be a sensible way to do it. So all I can say is that most ISPs are doing it this way, and I'm certainly not aware of any issue with it of that nature.
Okay, right. Oh, this is an interesting one from Linda, and possibly Maurice again. So it's not a question, but some may not know that twins can have the same date of birth, obviously, but potentially the same surname and almost the same minor, except for the suffix. So I think Indrisa is a twin, it seems. And would she be put through that possible route? Would she be a possible match?
Yeah, so it's a very good point. It's come up quite a bit in matching research. Actually, we had a lady at ITM who had a twin and knew that their NI numbers were one character. So it does need to be borne in mind when thinking about these things. And if you think of the first name, surname, date of birth, current postcode match criteria. So that should be fine because the twins should have different names. But as soon as you start allowing for any sort of variation in that, then are you certain enough to actually call it a match made, or would you want to go down the possible match route? So yes, twins are a known complexity, particularly because of the NI number point that you raised.
Okay, super.
I think it's inevitable, isn't it? We're going to get false positives and false negatives, and and we're going to learn from it, and we're going to learn more about matching in the first 6 months, having doing it in practice for millions of people, than all the theoretical, discussions we have. So it is inevitable.
You're absolutely right. It's once we start doing proper user testing with proper data, the synthetic data can never really sort of cut the mustard. I don't know which one, whether it's going to be sort of Paul or Geraldine, but we've got an AVC question, and it's quite straightforward. Are AVC providers mandated to cooperate with schemes, given that it's a trustee responsibility to show all data? And I know you've put some information out, and there's actually a whole appendix in the guidance on that. So maybe you can proceed.
I don't think there's anything in the legislation that mandates AVC providers. As you said, trustees have the responsibility, and trustees need to ensure that their providers are allowing them to satisfy the regulations. Now, there is provision in, and I can't remember where it was, but there was provision in some of the compliance and enforcement documents that says, if there's a problem, then the regulator could go after the underlying provider that's causing the problem, rather than going after the trustees who are doing their best to try and deal with it. So there's always that route. But I'm not sure it's particularly clear. What happens when we reach a stalemate and the trustees say we need this, and the AVC provider says, well, I can't or won't. I don't know quite where we land on that. Hopefully it won't happen very often.
And I think, just to add, that this is why we're trying to coordinate the working with AVC providers centrally, to avoid schemes having to have, or AVC providers having to receive multiple communications from individual schemes. It will be much more effective if we can have the conversation once and then support schemes in those discussions with the AVC providers. I think we need to recognise, and we've looked at this for some of our schemes. We've got some schemes with 3 members in a legacy AVC scheme. It's going to be really low priority for some AVC providers. So we need to make it easy for them to give us the information that we need. And it's going to be the same as many aspects of dashboard, where we just need to collaborate with the right people. One of the challenges we've had, I think, as PASA is finding the right people in the AVC providers to talk to, because it's not your normal day-to-day contact that gives you values. So if there are any AVC providers on the call and they can give us, some contact names, that would be really much appreciated and help us in this initiative to try and centralise this and make it an easier process for everyone.
Perfect. Well, we've got only a couple of minutes left, and what I'd like to do is take Chair's prerogative and ask the 3 of you to just spend less than a minute each, obviously, about whether or not there's, given the news we've had today, whether there's any additional benefits in prioritising dashboard activity on calculations and data. Maybe start with you, Geraldine.
I think the information we've had today, we don't have all the detail at the moment. From having planned out some of these projects, there is a lot to do to get value data to the point where we need it to be. So absolutely, I think we should crack on. And I think there are secondary benefits as well to having that data, either corrected or created, that trustees need to think about as well.
Paul?
I think it's very scheme specific. I mean, one of the benefits of what I've heard today in terms of the single connection deadline is those schemes who genuinely think they won't be around in 2026, whether they're winding up or whether they're changing administrator and they want a delay, that they do have that additional flexibility, and where it's genuinely needed, I think that's great. Beyond that, I think it comes down to how big is your problem. When you start to, when you read the guidance that we've issued today and you realise that you've got hundreds of people in every one of those categories, that's a big issue and you want to crack on with fixing it. If you read the guidance and think, actually, only 1 or 2 categories of those apply to me, and I've only got 1 or 2 members in that box, you know, fine, I'm fairly comfortable putting it down for another 6 months or a year, but find out how big your problem is.
Okay, Maurice, you've got 2 seconds.
2 seconds. Yeah, absolutely loads to do. It's the same teams out there that will need to create these processes to calculate the values that are doing other things like changing calculations for GMP equalization and when people transition administrators, all the rest of it. So absolutely, people should just press on with it as quickly as possible.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much. I think there was an awful lot to take in today. It is being recorded and probably will be on the website, and the guidance will be literally flying its way around very, very soon. Thank you, Geraldine, Paul and Maurice, for your contribution today. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.